thank you all for being here. I'm really excited to talk to you about Arthur Bliss's Sonata for viola and piano today. So just a brief overview of how the presentation will be organized. I'll kind of start from the largest possible vantage point and then focus all the way into the sonata. And I'll begin just by talking about Arthur Bliss, his life and his works, then touching a little bit on some of his early chamber music for strings. Then I'll talk about Lionel Curtis and the actual origins of the sonata. Then I will share a brief analysis of the piece, which will then be followed by a performance of the work. So to begin with, Arthur Bliss was born on August 2nd, 1891 in London. He had an American father and a British mother. His father moved to London in 1888, so just a couple years after Bliss was born. And his mother unfortunately died when he was 3 years old. But by all accounts, the Bliss family had a very happy childhood. And you can see in this picture here, there were 3 boys in the family and they all played music. Arthur was the oldest. He played piano. His next brother, Kennard, played clarinet, and then the youngest brother, Howard, played cello. And in his early years, for his education, he went to Pembroke College, which is one of the Oxford colleges, and got degrees in both history and music. And then he went on to the Royal College of Music, where he studied with Charles Stanford for composition. After his first year at the Royal College of Music, the World War II broke out, and he enlisted on the second day of the war. He spent basically the entire duration of the war in active duty. Within a couple of months of his enlistment, he was on the front lines in France on the Western Front. And he served in 2 different infantry units during his time in the war. He was wounded in the Battle of the Somme in July 1916, and he recuperated back in England. And after that, he was sent back to France as a captain. In that same battle, his brother Kennard was killed, which was a great loss for Bliss. And about a month before the end of the war, he suffered a gas attack in Cambria, which affected his breathing and respiration for the rest of his life. He apparently showed a lot of valor and courage on the battlefield. He was mentioned in dispatches back home in England, and there was a story of him running across battlefields of rifle fire to rescue injured comrades. In his memoir, he wrote about the kind of crystallizing effect that war can have on everyday experience. And so I'd like to read just one passage that he wrote. Bliss said, "I found in France, as many others did, that the appreciation of a moment's beauty had been intensified by the sordid contrast around. One's senses were so much more sharply on alert for sights and sounds that went unnoticed in peacetime because they were taken for granted. But a butterfly alighting on a trench parapet, a thrush's songs at stand to, a sudden rainbow became infinitely precious phenomenon, and indeed the sheer joy of being alive was more relished, for there was the continual possibility of sudden death." After the war, Bliss finished his studies at the Royal College of Music, and then he took a really important trip to France to perform his piano quartet. And while he was there, he got in touch with a lot of the leading French composers of the day, including Ravel, Honegger, Poulenc, and he also met Picasso and the poet Cocteau. Immediately upon coming back, he wrote 4 pieces that kind of put him on the map as a composer. These pieces, which are listed there, made him somewhat of an iconoclastic composer and created a big splash upon their premieres. We wouldn't really hear them today as being avant-garde, but they earned him a reputation, and that helped propel his career forward. And the most important milestone in his early career was he was invited by Edward Elgar to write a piece for the 3 Choirs Festival in Gloucester, England. And Elgar was the most important English composer who led the generation of younger composers at that time. And so for this commission, Bliss produced what is perhaps his best known work, which is called A Color Symphony. And this four-movement work is based on heraldry, and he takes a color for the title of each movement and kind of represents that color musically. So shortly after the successful premiere of this piece, Bliss accompanied his father when he moved back to the United States. So he lived in the States for about 2.5 years. While he was there, he laid the groundwork for his more international career, and one of his most important contacts was he met the noted arts patron Elizabeth Sprague Coolidge, who later commissioned his oboe quintet. And there he also met his wife, and they were married, and about 2 weeks after their marriage, they sailed back for London. After returning to England, he picked up a bunch of commissions from his time in the US. So he wrote for Pierre Monteux and the Boston Symphony, and also Leopold Stokowski and the Philadelphia Orchestra. And around the same time, he also started teaching at the Royal Academy of Music, teaching composition. And so in the 1930s and 40s, I'll just point out a couple important parts of his career. His major works listed over there include the clarinet quintet and the viola sonata, which we'll be going into a little more in depth later. One of his other important pieces was Music for Strings, which was a piece for string orchestra commissioned by the Vienna Philharmonic. During that time, he also wrote his first ballet, and then shortly following that, he wrote a piano concerto. The premiere of his piano concerto brought him to New York in 1939 during the World's Fair there. When they were there for the premiere, World War II broke out, so the family decided to stay in the States rather than risk the voyage back to London. So for about 18 months he stayed in the US, and while he was there he taught at the University of California, Berkeley, and he was a visiting professor of music. And there's a photo of him saying goodbye to some of his students there. Upon his return to England, he became the BBC's director of music, and he stayed in that post for a couple of years. And then finally, in the latter part of his career, the most important event was he was appointed in 1953 as the Master of the Queen's Music. This was kind of a ceremonial post where he would be called on to write music for specific functions or special occasions. And this kind of tapped into Bliss's love of ceremony and kind of pomp and circumstance. And a couple of his major large-scale compositions toward the end of his career were his violin concerto and his cello concerto. So now I'd just like to talk real briefly about some of his chamber music for strings. This list is all of the works that he wrote, chamber music works that use strings. His very first piece at the top is a funny quartet for piano, clarinet, cello, which were the instruments of the three Bliss children, plus their best friend who was a percussionist, so plus timpani. So kind of from his very first composition, he was writing music for special occasions and for special friends. Kind of skipping down to the bolded ones, those are his major works, the two late string quartets, and then the two quintets for woodwinds and strings, plus the viola sonata. What I would like to do is focus just a little bit on some of his earliest mature compositions, and that's his string quartet of 1914 and his piano quartet of 1915. Both of these were written while he was a student and also while he was serving in France. And even from some of these early compositions, you can see him looking fondly at the viola. The top example here is an excerpt from the first movement of his string quartet, and this is the second theme, where the viola has a nice soaring melody on the A string, accompanied by undulating triplets in the second violin and cello. And this sounds a lot like Ralph Vaughan Williams' music in that moment. Later on in the same piece, in the excerpt at the bottom, This is the second movement in which the viola plays about an 11-measure solo all by itself, introducing the entire movement. And then skipping over to the piano quartet, the entire piece begins with an unaccompanied viola melody, kind of similar to that other movement. So of the 6 movements between these two pieces, 2 of them start with solo viola. And so just by nature of that non-traditional type of writing, we can see Bliss looking fondly at the viola as a solo instrument. And so now I'd like to talk a little bit about the genesis of this sonata and his work with Lionel Curtis. So Bliss as a composer was always stimulated by external factors. He was very aware of this, and he actually wrote in his memoir, he said, "I have always found it easier to write dramatic music rather than pure music. I like the stimulus of words, or a theatrical setting, a colorful occasion, or the collaboration of a great player. There is only a little of the spider about me, spinning his own web from his inner being. I am more of a magpie type." So Bliss was influenced by all sorts of things, from literature to art to even a book on medieval heraldry, which is what inspired his A Color Symphony. And so this work over here, this painting by George Dennett, is one in a series that Bliss was inspired to write one of his last orchestral works, the Metamorphic Variegations. And early in his career, he worked with the painter Claude Lovett Fraser, and he wrote some dramatic music to some of his plays. And here's a painting of Fraser with these stark primary colors that looks and sounds a lot like Bliss's music. Aside from other artistic inspirations, Bliss had a lot of practical inspirations. And most of that was writing music for specific players. You can see in this chart here, there's the 2 works for the major American symphonies, then the quintet for Leon Goossens, the quintet also for Frederick Thurston, and then moving a little bit later, he wrote for lots of great soloists, including Rostropovich. And in working on his violin concerto, he talked about how he would work very closely with the soloist, who was Alfredo Camboli. And Bliss said, "I learned a lot about the violin technique from him. As each section of the concerto was sketched, I would take it to his house and we would play it through together. If a passage seemed to him ineffective, he would exaggerate its difficulty, distorting his face in anguish. He would then suggest an alteration and play it again, murmuring, 'Beautiful, beautiful.' I was always amused by this play acting, but the result of his persuasive cajoling was that the concerto is certainly apt for the instrument." So even if the player was joking around with him, he still appreciated the feedback. So for the viola sonata, he worked really closely with Lionel Curtis. And Lionel Curtis, just to fill in a little bit of his details, he was probably one of the most important violists who's ever lived. He did more to elevate the instrument into a solo instrument than any other single person. Perhaps his most important accomplishment is the large body of music that he was responsible for. I counted at least 63 compositions, original compositions, that were either dedicated to him or works that he commissioned. And here's a nice photo of Curtis playing on his Montagnana viola. And it looks like he's playing a major sixth up there, which could be from the Bliss Sonata or from the Walton Concerto. There's lots of sixths, as we'll talk about in a couple minutes. But this is one thing that he was also really noted for, was playing in extremely high registers. And Bliss reflected that in his piece, which I will point out. And here's just a plaque of Curtis, so he has a nice memorial outside of his house in Wimbledon, London. So Bliss and Curtis, they first came into contact at, well, maybe just tangential because Tertis was the violist in the premiere of the piano quintet that we talked about earlier, so he played that opening solo. Bliss wasn't actually at that performance because he was in France fighting in the war at that time, but at least Tertis was familiar with his music. Upon returning from the war, Bliss mentioned Tertis was playing in some lectures and talked about how Tertis had a perfection of ensemble with his fellow musicians. And then a couple years after that, Tertis arranged a work of Bliss for viola, so the two were definitely well aware of each other and each other's performing music. Then in my research, I came across a couple really interesting coincidences between Arthur Bliss, Lionel Tertis, and William Walton. One of these first coincidences is that Walton wrote a viola concerto for Lionel Tertis. And one explanation for this inspiration was that Walton attended Tertis's performance of the Bach Chaconne on viola. And Bliss also remembers attending perhaps the same performance and writes about it in his memoir. So I'm always curious if Bliss and Walton were in the same room for that one performance that might have resulted in two massive works for the instrument. One of the other nice coincidences is that during the private premiere of the Bliss Sonata at Bliss's house, Walton was the one turning the pages for the pianist. And then one of the more fascinating ones for me is that although Walton wrote the concerto for for Tertis, Tertis actually rejected the first performance. And he basically said the writing was far-fetched and he couldn't quite understand it. And his exact quote is that he wasn't accustomed to playing F natural when the octave above it was F sharp. But he clearly got over that quickly by the time the Bliss Sonata rolled around a couple years later, because in the very first measure of the first movement, we have F natural on the bottom and F sharp on the top. Tertis later performed the Walton's concerto about a year after rejecting it, so he got over it pretty quickly. But I just think it's great that he chose to say F and F sharp in his letter, because it works out so perfectly with the Bliss Sonata. So similar to the collaboration with Alfredo Campoli, Bliss and Tertis had a very fruitful time. Bliss wrote, "I think my viola sonata should have Tertis's name coupled with mine as joint composers. For many times in the course of its composition, I would be called to the telephone by Tertis with his viola at the other end. I would hear his voice, on page 17, line 3, do you like this? Then I would hear the tones of the viola, or this. He would then repeat the passage. But Lionel, I don't hear much of a difference. But you must, he would answer. The first time I took 2 down bows, etc., etc. So I just kind of chuckle at this image of Tertis huddling over the telephone. And I'm sure the quality was awful, because if we've ever played over even iPhones today, the quality is awful. So who knows what Bliss was hearing on the other end. Another nice tidbit about Bliss and the viola is he took a couple of semesters of viola lessons when he was younger. But Bliss wrote in his memoir that his collaboration with Tertis taught him so much more about the viola as an instrument than any of his actual viola lessons. Might be a dig on his teacher. So the work was premiered on May 9th, 1933 at Arthur Bliss's home, and then it received its public premiere November 3rd of that same year at the BBC Broadcasting House. There's a clipping from the Daily Mail of the first broadcast of a viola sonata by a world-famous composer. The pianist in the premiere was Solomon Kuttner, and he went only by the first name of Solomon, and he was a great child prodigy in England at that time. He was quite a famous name in musical circles there, and Bliss later wrote his piano concerto for him. Tertis and him played together pretty frequently, and there exists a recording of Brahms' second E-flat major sonata with the two of them. And the early reviews of the sonata were extremely positive. Marion M. Scott was probably the most effusive in his praise. He said, "Seldom has a new work left one with a livelier desire to hear it again. Arthur Bliss has mirrored something in Lionel Tertis's own character in the music, that exquisite artistic reticence which is yet compatible with such heartfelt expression. And I think he's exactly right in terms of putting Tertis into the actual work. A couple other notable performances of this piece. About 2 years after its premiere, Tertis played it with the great pianist Arthur Rubinstein. And the funny thing about this one is Rubinstein actually did not get the music until the morning of the performance. And both Tertis and Bliss wrote about this in their memoirs. I think he even arrived in London the morning of the performance from ship over from America. So this was not a very well rehearsed performance, to say the least. But both Tertis and Bliss seemed very complimentary about it. Bliss called it an electrifyingly assured performance. He didn't mention anything about the accuracy of the notes, but we'll leave that up to someone else to decide. Tertis and Solomon performed it until at least 1944, and that was right towards the end of Tertis's performing career. So this work stayed in his repertoire for quite some time. And then a couple of Tertis's students also performed it, and it again garnered really incredible praise from Marion Scott, as he called it one of the best sonatas of recent time, when he was writing in the Musical Times. So now I will give a little overview of the actual sonata itself, and then I will perform it. The piece is in 4 movements. The last 2 movements are to be played attacca without interruption. The first 2 movements are the most substantial, and each of their length is about the same as the final 2 movements combined. The third movement is a type of virtuoso showpiece and could almost stand on its own as an encore piece. The main idea in the form and structure of this work is what I'm calling polythematicism. Basically, Bliss is taking a huge number of themes and combining them and playing them off of each other to create the overall structure of his piece. There's no sort of set form that the piece adheres to. You can't call it sonata form or rondo form or variation form, but rather Bliss introduces this huge number of melodies and they all kind of work against each other. For example, in the first movement, there's at least 11 unique themes or melodies that Bliss alters and changes, not just motives, but actually kind of substantial melodies. So the piece is jam-packed with thematic content. Bliss actually wrote about this in a lecture that he delivered around the time, little after the premiere of this viola sonata. He said there's 2 ways to create unity in a composition. One would be to have it grow from a single motive or a tiny one little germ, which someone like Bach was a master at. And the other, which he wrote about, he said it was unity in diversity, the employment of not one idea that spreads, but 2 or more antagonistic ideas that are gradually compelled to harmonize and form one complete whole. This implies drama and struggle, and it is the formal idea lying behind the first movement of a Beethoven sonata, for instance. The first principle develops from a single thematic idea. The second one is based on the interaction of several contrasted ones. And one tiny excerpt from the viola part in the third movement can show this. In these 3 measures, we have 3 separate thematic ideas happening. The first measure is this sort of lyrical, stepwise melody. The second one is this rushing, skittering scale. And the third measure has kind of march-like dotted figures. And more than just putting themes one after the other, Bliss will stack them on top of each other pretty frequently. So in these 2 measures from the second movement, we've got 3 of that movement's themes present. In the viola, it's playing the sort of rotating 6th figure, while the piano plays the movement's 2nd theme. And then in the very next measure, the piano plays the movement's 1st theme, the kind of introductory theme. And he's also doing this in the third movement as well. And more so than just different themes, he actually puts the two players in different meters, causing some interesting cross rhythms there. And this idea of combining themes reaches its zenith in the last movement, where Bliss almost recaps the entire piece and borrows themes from each movement and puts them together. This is the beginning of the final section of the piece here, and Bliss takes the opening melody in its same key and same register in the viola and borrows the primary theme from the third movement in the piano. And these triplets create this incredible, almost dirge-like effect to this theme. And when I play this, I play it without vibrato, non-vibrato, to give it a really empty, kind of death-like effect. One other technique that he uses a couple times is a Hocket-like effect, where viola and piano are trading the notes of a different theme, of a single theme. And this is one passage where this happens from the third movement. Bliss is a tonal composer. He always has key centers, but sometimes he creates those key centers in different ways. The piece begins and ends in D minor, but basically everywhere in between there he visits every other possibility in terms of key area. In the first movement, he visits D flat, D, E flat, E, F, F sharp, G, A flat, A, and C. And these are not just like chords on one key, but he actually, I guess, harmonizes in that key. So that's 10 out of the possible 12 key areas in just one movement. The overlying tonal gesture in this piece is that of the false relation, where he has, for instance, a C in one octave and a C sharp in the other octave, which is what irked Tertis about the Walton Concerto. And so in this passage from one of the early parts of the first movement, there's 4 different false relations just in the right hand of the piano here. And that happens throughout the work. This top passage is in the viola, shortly following that, the one from the previous page. And there's the opening gesture with the F natural versus F sharp. And then finally, in the beginning of the second movement, he uses some enharmonic spelling. So it starts in a B flat major chord, and then the third sinks down to C sharp, which could be a D flat to make it a minor triad. False relations were prominent in a couple other viola works at that time, most notably the Walton Concerto, where these false relation sixths happen throughout the whole piece. This is a passage from the end of the first movement where you can see some of those same false relations. And Walton admittedly stole this idea from Hindemith, who a couple years earlier had written them in his Camera Music No. 5, which is a concerto for viola and chamber orchestra. And this is the end of the second movement of that work, where you see the false relations also in sixth in the viola. And then finally, I'd just like to point out a couple of the effects that Tertis had on this work. And that mostly comes with the extremely high range that Bliss writes in. In the highest and the bottom passage here, both go up to a high A on the viola, which is a note that you very rarely see in viola literature, definitely don't see it in orchestra literature. Before writing this piece, the highest note Bliss had written for viola was a D, so a perfect fifth below that. So the presence of Tertis in his life definitely expanded his conception of what the viola could play. In the middle passage here, actually that high E is beyond that end of the fingerboard, so that's really high. And then finally, the third movement has a sort of viola cadenza in it, and this viola cadenza, it's I basically have to point out that it sounds exactly like a moment from a Hindemith sonata. And you can see the similarity just in looking at the gestures. Rapidly repeated open Cs plus double stops, interjecting at different times. And although I don't know if Bliss ever heard this sonata, I am sure I wouldn't be afraid to say that he stole it from Hindemith in this part. So that's towards the end of the third movement, which you'll hear. And so that wraps up my comments about the piece, and I would like to invite Speer to come up, and we're going to perform the work for you.
Thank you.